What would you feel if you opened an old county archive and found names written carefully in ink? Names that appear in no census, no parish register, no graveyard stone. Names that begin and then abruptly end without explanation. Whole branches of family lines neatly crossed out in a hand that never signed its own work. This is Sleepy History Tales. Before we turn the first page, let me welcome you. Write in the comments the place and the hour from which you are watching tonight. I want to know where you are and when you are. And if you're willing, join our growing archive by subscribing and liking this video. For these stories, buried for generations, survive only when we remember them together. Our investigation begins in Pennsylvania in the year 1866. The nation was still bleeding from civil war, yet already covering its wounds with wealth, with industry, and with the new language of science. Families of prominence had everything to lose: fortunes, inheritances, reputations. And when their sons or daughters did not fit the roles demanded of them, when they whispered of instability or threatened scandal, they were quietly delivered away. The doors they entered promised restoration. But what awaited inside was something altogether different. On the hill above a quiet town stood an institution praised in newspapers as a model of modern care. A sanatorium with gardens, parlors, and polished verandas. But behind its barred corridors, its hidden wards, and its concealed furnaces, something darker was taking shape. The ledger remains a record not of patients, but of clients whose fates were sealed with signatures and with payments made in advance. Tonight, we will turn its pages together. What we discover will not be healing, but the story of how silence itself became a science. In 1866, Pennsylvania carried the weight of both ruin and rebirth. The war had ended, but its residue lingered in every ledger, every graveyard, and in the limping gait of scarred veterans along village roads. The nation spoke of progress of iron rails, stretching across valleys of factories, rising of science, newly crowned as the language of certainty. Yet beneath all this optimism stirred a quieter fear. The fear of weak bloodlines, of degeneracy of heirs unfit to inherit this new age of industry. Families of stature whispered not only of fortunes, but of the children who might squander them. And in that silence, opportunity arose. It was in this climate that the Finch brothers, Alice Tester and Silas Croft Finch, identical in face but divergent in nature, raised their sanatorium on a green rise outside town. To passing eyes, it appeared not as an asylum, but as a house of refinement. High gabled roofs trimmed in white, verandas draped in ivy, gardens measured with the neat precision of Euclidean geometry. Even the approach was designed to soothe gravel drives curving in slow arcs, as though guiding not only carriages but troubled minds toward order and repose. Families who arrived at the wrought iron gates felt reassured before a word was even spoken. The language used within was carefully chosen. No one here was called an inmate, not even a patient. They were clients welcomed into a place of restorative science. Brochures printed on thick cream paper promised harmonic treatments of the mind, fresh hygienic air, and the balancing of humors through empirical method. Words of old superstition madness, melancholy lunacy were banished. Instead, the Finch brothers spoke of adjustment, rejuvenation, refinement. Respectable families, uneasy with the specter of scandal, found solace in this diction. Their kin were not abandoned, they were being perfected. The grounds reflected this rhetoric. To the east stood a sunlit wing lined with French windows. Music drifted from pianos, and parlors gleamed with walnut and velvet. Those deemed presentable strolled beneath orchard trees, always under supervision, their steps staged to appear pastoral. But to the west, less visible to visiting eyes, stretched another wing. Its windows were narrow, its brickwork plain, its entry locked and unadorned. Families were guided away from that direction. Tours lingered only in drawing rooms, in libraries stocked with the latest medical texts. And yet, something could not be concealed. An air of vigilance pervaded the grounds. Orderlies moved not as attendants, but as guards. Their uniforms bore no insignia, yet the rigidity of their routines betrayed a discipline foreign to hospitality. Visitors, reassured by this spectacle of precision, rarely questioned it. Efficiency was mistaken for benevolence, restraint for safety. But what was truly being restrained, and who among those names in the ledger, would never be seen again? The Finch brothers themselves seemed to embody this strange dual promise. Alistair, eloquent smiling, was the one most often seen. He appeared at gatherings polished in dress and manner, lecturing on the dawn of psychiatric science. He quoted Galton and Darwin with equal ease, weaving their words into a language that felt at once modern and inevitable. Silas, by contrast, was almost never glimpsed beyond the grounds. He lingered in the West Wing, where his silence took on a quality nearly priestly. He tended to logistics with a precision that suggested devotion more than duty. Together, they created a perfect symmetry. One brother, the public healer; the other, the vigilant custodian. And in those early years, the sanatorium prospered. Families who crossed its gates did so with visible relief, believing they had discovered a rare alliance, science and discretion, hand in hand, shielding them from scandal. Yet even in the records of the time, faint echoes remain. Visitors wrote of an unease they could not quite name, as though the house itself wore two faces, one turned outward in light, the other concealed in shadow. To the world beyond, the Finch brothers were indistinguishable. They shared the same lean frame, the same angular profile, and the same cold grey eyes that measured rather than gazed. Yet for those who lingered long enough to watch, a divergence became clear. One brother spoke, the other listened. One extended the hand of welcome. The other turned the key in the lock when backs were turned. Alistair moved with ease through parlors and lecture halls. His voice was cultivated for persuasion. To the devout, he quoted scripture. To the skeptical, he offered statistics. To the refined, he murmured poetry. He knew when to bow his head in solemn sympathy and when to smile as though privy to knowledge too delicate to name. In his presence, families whispered their darkest secrets, confessions that would never be spoken aloud elsewhere. The inconvenient child, the unstable wife, the heir too fragile for inheritance. And Alistair received these secrets not with judgment, but with gravity. He promised that modern science could transform private shame into dignified silence. In return, he secured trust and payment. Silas, however, prowled the inner corridors with a vigilance that never wavered. His presence was known by the staff long before his steps appeared in a doorway. He measured sedatives with mathematical precision. He checked locks twice over. He intercepted letters before they could leave the grounds. patients soon learned that resistance brought them not before a doctor but before the silent twin, whose very stillness made struggle seem pointless. While Alcestis charmed patrons with talk of renewal, Silas enforced the permanence of confinement. This division of labor was deliberate and it sustained the machine. One twin harvested reputation, the other ensured it could never be undone by escape exposure or scandal. Families left the sanatorium believing their loved ones had entered a sanctuary of refinement. Those inside knew otherwise, but they had no voice to contradict. In this balance, the system thrived. Alcestis as mask, Silas as mechanism, and soon the elite clientele grew. Carriages bearing crests from Philadelphia, from Baltimore, even from New York, began to arrive at the East Wing. Their names rarely appeared in public records of admission, but their money flowed into the Finch brothers' coffers. The sanatorium became more than a place of treatment. It became a vault, a place where reputations could be secured, where the inconvenient could be hidden beneath velvet curtains and polished marble. Discretion was its true commodity, and the Finch brothers were masters of its trade. Yet those who found themselves close enough to witness both men often remarked in hushed tones that Alcestis' warmth seemed oddly rehearsed, a performance masking fatigue. Silas's silence, on the other hand, was not the quiet of shyness. It was vigilance, as though he alone understood just how fragile their constructed balance truly was. Together they seemed less like brothers and more like serpents twined, each coil reinforcing the other, each movement purposeful, each strike concealed until necessity demanded it. But even within this symmetry, whispers arose among the staff. Whispers of a place more hidden, still a chamber barred, even from junior nurses, spoken of only in fragments. If the East Wing displayed refinement and the West Wing enforced obedience, then this inner place was something else entirely. Sealed, silent, unseen, waiting like the second head of a serpent ready to reveal its fangs. The sanatorium itself seemed divided against its own body. From the east, sunlight poured through tall French windows. Parlors glowed with walnut wood chandeliers scattering golden light. Carpets softened each step. A faint trace of lavender water drifted in the air. Guests were offered tea in porcelain cups, while physicians spoke in low tones of balance, harmony, recovery. Every detail reassured families that their loved ones were sheltered in comfort. But to the west, the air shifted. Brickwork darkened windows, narrowed to thin vertical slits, admitting only a blade of light. Doors were secured with iron fittings. Corridors rang with hollow echoes, the scent of carbolic soap lingering. Few visitors entered here, and when they asked, Alcestis waved them off with vague words of advanced treatments requiring privacy and quiet. It was Silas who walked these halls most often, his very appearance enough to smother resistance. And beneath both wings lay yet another layer, a substructure known only to the initiated. Behind locked double doors, a stair descended into stone. Torches hissed in iron brackets. This was the theater. Not for music, but for procedures carried out under the banner of science. Narrow tables stood in rows, straps hanging like dormant serpents at their sides. In adjoining chambers, cages held patients stripped of clothing, their identities reduced to initials scratched onto slate boards. Orderlies moved in shadow, carrying tinctures blades and ledgers of results, and at the far end, the furnace. Its brick mouth glowed with a hunger that never ceased, fed with scraps of ruined garments, and at times what was left when treatments failed. The chimney rose high above the roofline. Townsfolk mistook its smoke for nothing more than coal heating. Few noticed the faint sweetness in the air, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. The architecture itself seemed designed for duplicity. Every comfort in the east wing had its shadow in the west. Velvet chairs mirrored by iron restraints. Wide verandas countered by narrow corridors. Sunlight above, torchlight below. To walk between them was to move along a spectrum between civility and cruelty, as though the building itself embodied the two faces of its creators. A house not merely built to conceal, but to persuade, convincing outsiders that benevolence reigned even as silence smothered those within. The grounds themselves reinforced the illusion. An iron fence wrapped the estate like a crown of thorns, patrolled not by gentle attendants, but by guards in plain coats. Their task was not to welcome, but to warn. No one crossed that line without permission. Within, the walls were built to silence. Sound-proofed plaster swallowed every cry before it reached the garden air. Families strolling among roses never heard the clatter of restraints or the muffled wails echoing below. At dusk, as lamps glowed in parlors and tea was poured into porcelain cups, the same light flickered behind hidden grates beneath their feet. The fire that warmed the hearths of the east wing also consumed what was hidden in the furnaces below. In this house of two-faced light and shadow drew upon the same flame. Among those shadows, a figure emerged whose power eclipsed even the Finch brothers. Nurse Eva Brandt, head matron self-appointed guardian of doctrine, ruled with a zeal that turned cruelty into custom and silence into law. If Alcester and Silas were the mask and the lock, she was the hand that made both unshakable. She wore her uniform as though it were vestment starched white beneath her dark apron keys clinking at her waist like a rosary of authority. At dawn, she conducted her rounds not with tenderness but with ritual. Patients were inspected, measured and judged against standards only she seemed to understand. Doses of laudanum and chloral hydrate were portioned like sacraments. The frail were subdued into docility. The unruly were stilled with injections that left their tongues heavy, their limbs unwilling to resist. In her ledger, these were not punishments but therapies. Progress, as she called it. Junior nurses orbited her like anxious satellites, terrified of drifting from her path. They had seen what happened to those who questioned her. One attendant who dared to argue over dosages was sent to furnace duty for a month. Another who showed too much compassion to a restrained girl was dismissed outright. Her wages withheld, her reputation poisoned with whispers of incompetence. Everyone understood loyalty to Brandt was survival. It was she who decided which patients were shifted from east to west, who required sedation, who would undergo procedures. She called weakness the mark of flawed blood. Those she selected rarely returned. In her eyes, she was not enforcing cruelty, but purifying society, one frail body at a time. A glance from her could still a corridor. The clipped cadence of her shoes striking stone was enough to draw trembling compliance. Even Silas deferred to her in certain matters. Locks and guards may have been his domain, but Brant achieved obedience without chains. Her devotion freed the brothers to maintain their facade of legitimacy, while her invisible hand did the dosing, the silencing, the erasing. Over time, the West Wing ceased to resemble a hospital at all. It became her kingdom. Patients were no longer people, but categories to be corrected or extinguished. The staff bent to her will until cruelty was no longer recognized as cruelty, but duty. And so the institution endured not only through the design of the Finch brothers, but through the fervor of its gatekeeper, whose zeal transformed horror into order and silence into permanence. In the ledgers of the sanatorium, entries did not begin with ailments. They began with surnames. For this house did not live on illness, it lived on discretion. The families who came did not seek cures. They sought concealment. There were daughters who carried children outside the bonds of marriage. Their shame was hidden beneath shawls as carriages rattled to the gates. To admit them at home would mean scandal. To send them away under the guise of nervous collapse meant silence. There were wives whose tempers embarrassed their husbands in drawing rooms, redefined as sufferers of hysteria. Some returned compliant. More often, they never returned at all. There were sons' heirs whose instability threatened estates and investments. The Finch brothers promised rejuvenation, corrective therapies the language of science. Fathers signed checks in advance and in so doing, transferred inheritance from their children to the coffers of the institution. And there were children themselves, boys with twisted limbs, girls who could not speak or walk steadily. Their families arrived weeping, convincing themselves this house offered specialized care. Fees were paid, paperwork signed, the carriage rolled away, lighter than it had arrived. The ritual of intake never varied. Families stepped through polished doors, welcomed by lavender air and velvet chairs. Clerks produced parchment contracts, written in gentle, oblique terms. Nervous complaint, emotional instability, hereditary frailty. Payment was requested in advance, sometimes entire inheritances signed away with a trembling hand. And once the ink was dry, the loved one was led down a side corridor. Families rarely insisted on following. Those who did were quietly turned back toward the carriage, told their presence might hinder recovery. What followed was a silence shared on both sides. Families sent few letters. The sanatorium sent replies in the same careful hand, repeating the same phrases. Progress was measured, health was maintained, improvements were anticipated. With each passing month, contact faded, replaced by quiet relief. Burdens had been lifted, scandal averted, and so the Finch brothers turned stigma into revenue. For every shame concealed, another wing was furnished, another fence raised. The language of medicine cloaked the reality of disappearance. Households spoke not of kin abandoned, but of duty fulfilled. Those who entered seldom re-emerged. The carriages left lighter, while the doors of the West Wing closed heavier with every admission. Records list names signed in ink, but beyond those, signatures, nothing, only silence. Until one storm-racked night when silence finally broke. The storm came sudden, violent, as though the heavens themselves split open above the hills. Rain slashed the slate roof. Thunder rolled like artillery across the valley. Lightning cut the sky in fleeting, blinding exposures. And it was in one of those white-hot instants that young Finn O'Malley, a stable boy, saw something he could never unsee. Drawn from the stables by a strange glow at the western wall, Finn pressed himself against the stone and peered through the downpour. There, two orderlies struggling with a heavy burden. Lightning tore the sky wide, and for one breathless instant, he saw them clear. The limp body of a woman, her nightdress soaked and clinging her head, lolling arms slack as though already emptied of life. They dragged her toward the furnace chamber. Its brick mouth glowed against the storm's darkness. Finn's heart pounded the rain, concealing the heat that rose to his face. He watched as the iron door was wrenched open, firelight searing the night. The woman was lifted, pushed forward, and vanished into the blaze. The door clanged shut. Sparks leapt into the rain, and in the next lightning flash, the men were gone. The furnace left its burn, though not upon stone alone, but upon the boy who had witnessed its secret cargo. At first he did not run. He only stumbled back, chest-tight breath shallow, as if the sight were too vast, too impossible for his mind to hold. Only when the thunder cracked again above the hills did his legs obey, carrying him down through the mud, slipping and gasping toward the safety of town. By dawn, trembling and drenched, he had found the sheriff. The words tumbled from his lips like sparks from the fire. He had seen the body, the flames, the orderlies, the unmistakable crime. Yet, the sheriff, bound in debts, whispered but well known, listened with a weary patience. He reminded the boy how storms twist shadows, how lightning deceives the eye, how imagination breeds phantoms when fear and rain combine. Perhaps, he said gently, it had been an animal carcass discarded from the infirmary and burned, nothing more. Finn's protests rose like a tide, but against the calm, practiced tone of authority, his cries withered into silence, and when the tale reached the townsfolk, it was softened further. A lad caught in a storm, they said, frightened by shadows. They smiled with pity, but never echoed his claim. For who among them would accuse the Finch brothers' patrons of the county men of learning and medicine? To press such a charge was to risk one's place, one's livelihood, perhaps even one's safety. So Finn returned to the stables, no hero's welcome awaiting him. Neighbors averted their gaze. Children whispered and mocked. His words, once desperate truth, became, instead, the proof of his youth, his foolishness. And yet, when night returned, he looked uphill again. Behind the veil of rain, the chimney of the west wing glowed faintly, its smoke twisting skyward as if in silent testimony. He clenched his fists, for though no one believed, he knew what he had seen. A woman's body consumed in the fire of a place that dared call itself a house of healing. The very next morning, Alistair Finch himself entered the sheriff's office not as a man accused, but as a benefactor, inconvenienced. He carried a calfskin ledger in one arm and a sheath of papers embossed with seals from distant medical boards in the other. His composure was unshaken, his attire untouched by the violence of the night before. Where Finn's story trembled with urgency, Finch's voice radiated calm authority. He spoke softly, even kindly, of youth's confusion. The storm was violent, he murmured, and shadows, Will they play cruel tricks upon frightened minds? Then he opened the ledger. Line after line catalogued the disposal of animal carcasses used in research dogs. Pigs, sheep complete with weights, dates, and the signatures of farmers whose livelihoods depended upon Finch patronage. On the very night Finn swore he had seen a woman's body, the ledger recorded the burning of a fever-stricken pig. The neat columns, the official seals, the ink itself, all spoke louder than the boy's frightened voice. The sheriff, already in quiet debt to the brothers, accepted the explanation with visible relief. Paper, after all, is far easier to trust than the terror of a stable boy. And so, with one book laid open on a desk, truth was rewritten. Later that day, the sheriff placed a hand on Finn's shoulder, spoke softly of imagination, and fear of the dangers of letting fancies take root. And yet, the matter did not end with dismissal alone. Subtler whispers planted with deliberate care by Alistair began to spread. The boy was high-strung, some said, prone to exaggeration. Hadn't he once stumbled in his duties at the stables? Hadn't he shown signs of nervousness before? Soon his reputation shifted, and the story of the woman in the flames was retold not as warning, but as evidence of his weakness. Neighbors turned away. Children laughed. Even his father, tied by wages to the sanatorium, urged him to silence. And so, Finn was undone, not by chains, but by ridicule. Alone he carried the truth that no one dared share. Meanwhile, the furnace burned on its smoke, curling upward each night, indistinguishable from any hearth in town. Paper had triumphed over witness, reputation over truth. In the locked journals of the Finch brothers, however, another story unfolded, one not meant for the sheriff's desk. Between the columns of numbers and fees lay words that revealed the true ambition of the sanatorium. Not healing, not even confinement, but creation. The brothers sought to breed, not simply to contain, to sculpt a lineage they believed would embody obedience, silence, and submission. At the center of their design was one woman, unnamed in any surviving record. She appears only as the bride. She had once been admitted like so many others under the polite disguise of hereditary frailty. But after that, her identity was erased. In the journals, she is not a person, only a vessel, a matrix. Her body described in the cold terms of utility, her life reduced to procedure. Men of strong constitution were brought in under arrangement, persuaded by promises of scientific immortality. These pairings were not marriages, but operations timed by Brandt's ledgers, observed with clinical detachment. When conception failed, the entries note interventions. Tonics forced down invasive examinations, even crude surgeries in search of correction. And when conception succeeded, the notes continued with the same detached script complication, hemorrhage, delirium, fever. One attempt ended in stillbirth, another in burial before dawn. The woman's suffering was logged not as pain but as variable. Her mind was dulled with tinctures. Her will was broken with early forms of psychosurgery, what later scholars would recognize as brutal experiments upon the brain. She became compliant, emptied, reduced to an instrument of the brothers' program. The journals also spoke of sterilizations. Patients not chosen for breeding were instead cut off from all posterity. Scalpel where there should have been counsel. Silence where there should have been family. each procedure justified in the same words: prevention of weakness service to the community refinement of the species. For families who sought discretion, the institution delivered obliteration, and of the bride's children, only brief notes remain: viable, non-viable, reabsorbed. Their tiny bodies either lost to miscarriage or consigned to the furnace when judged imperfect. Each loss recorded like the failure of a crop, each life erased without acknowledgement of its humanity. The woman herself began to fade, not in body, but in words. With each line of the journal, she receded further until even her existence felt spectral, erased beneath the sterile language of experiment. By the final pages, she was no longer described as a patient, nor even as a woman, but as a concept. The living proof of an idea, flesh bound to doctrine. A bride not to love or family, but to the monstrous ideal of a docile bloodline. No grave carries her name. No voice of hers remains. Only those cold entries where identity was stripped away so completely that she lingers now as a shadow, the bride of the program. It was in the spring of 1871 that Dr. Elias Thorne arrived at the Finch Sanatorium. He was young earnest, trained in the new study of nervous disorders, and eager to serve both science and humanity. Drawn by Alistair Finch's published lectures on restorative medicine, Elias believed he was entering a model for the future, a place where order, hygiene, and modern method could soothe troubled minds. His first impressions seemed to confirm that hope. The carriage carried him past blooming pear trees and gravel walks glistening with dew. Nurses in white aprons moved briskly between parlors, perfumed with lavender and coal smoke. From an open window, a Schubert waltz drifted into the morning air. To Elias it seemed an asylum recast as sanctuary, but unease came quickly. Patients he met in the East Wing greeted him with hollow smiles. Their eyes dulled, their movements heavy, as if tugged by invisible strings. Their words faltered, repeated in eerie similarity. It was not peace Elias felt in those rooms, but sedation laudanum thick in the air, clinging to curtains, staining their very breath. This was not healing, but smothering. When he asked to see case files, hoping to study methods and treatments, he was met with polite denial. Records Alistair explained were too confidential, too bound to family reputation. Only vague summaries were offered, notes on progress, stability, regimen. Elias pressed, but the answer never changed, delivered always with the same benevolent smile. The silence felt deliberate. Even the staff reflected the tension. Junior nurses spoke in clipped tones, eyes wary, words measured. The orderlies moved like machines, offering only functional replies. And when Elias asked even lightly about the West Wing, their faces closed, their voices fell silent. He noticed too how laughter ceased the moment Eva Brandt's footsteps echoed down the hall, how the strike of her heels upon stone silenced a corridor. What unsettled Elias most was the segregation of space. The East Wing, with its polished comfort, seemed almost theatrical. But at the far end of a locked passage behind a barred transom lay the West Wing. From beyond its iron silence, faint movement stirred. Sometimes whispers, sometimes cries. He could not be sure. But each time he passed that door, he felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing back through the wood. By the end of his first week, his admiration had soured into suspicion. The calm he had once praised now appeared as enforced stillness. He found himself lingering often by that barred door, listening as though the truth itself strained to be heard from behind it. And in time, Elias found an ally. Clara Weiss, a nurse, barely 20, her pale face marked with the burden of complicity. She obeyed Brandt as all must, but her eyes betrayed unease when patients were dosed beyond reason, when others were led away and never returned. Elias approached her cautiously with simple kindness, small gestures of shared burden. In a world where suspicion ruled, kindness became a language of trust. It was Clara who first whispered of the key. Brandt's great ring of brass and iron carried many, but among them was one seldom used, handled with ceremony, the master key to the West Wing. Clara dared not touch it, but she described it in secret, its peculiar shape, its long teeth. Her voice trembled, but Elias sensed she had chosen him deliberately. That night, he pressed a cake of soap into a tin, and in a passing moment, made an impression of the key. Back in his chamber by candlelight, he poured wax into the mold, fashioning a crude duplicate. Imperfect, fragile, but enough. Enough to turn the wards when midnight silence cloaked the halls. So began his clandestine entries. By lamplight, he crept through deserted corridors, where even the air seemed to recoil from intrusion. Behind one locked door, he found no patients, but shelves of ledgers. Dozens of calfskin volumes with unmarked spines. Inside, ciphered pages, symbols, numbers twined with letters. A language designed to conceal. He smuggled fragments back, copying them by candle flame, testing substitutions, piecing patterns always with one ear, tuned to footsteps beyond his door. And slowly, the cipher yielded. Words emerged: sterilization, vessel, cohabitation. Then names, families of stature, their reputations polished, yet their kin consigned to silence within these walls. What dawned on Elias was not one cruelty, but a structure. A commerce of human bodies cloaked in the rhetoric of science. Families paid not for cures, but for erasure. Procedures logged with chilling precision, incisions, dosages. Confinements, the tally of infants consigned to the furnace. At last, Elias set down his pen, his candle guttering low. And he realized the truth was larger than the Finch brothers alone. The names in those ledgers reached outward to physicians in distant cities, to correspondences abroad, to a network vast enough to shield every horror within those walls. The sanatorium, as Elias Thorne came to understand, was never the true heart of the matter. It was only a visible node, a front of brick and ivy, masking a design that stretched far beyond its grounds. Holding the ledgers close, feeling their weight press into his ribs, he realized he was no longer a witness on the edge of a secret. He was entangled within it, carrying fragments of truth that placed him in the very crosshairs of those who had perfected the art of erasure. The night of his escape came without moon or mercy. Clouds strangled the sky, the estate reduced to a darker shape against the storm. The ledger's 2 volumes, swollen with cipher names, and the arithmetic of silence were sewn deep into the lining of his coat oilskin against the rain. Each movement had been rehearsed, but rehearsals do not quiet the knowledge that capture meant not punishment but disappearance. A vanishing as final as any name crossed out in the ledger's black ink. At midnight, with the estate hushed in uneasy slumber, Elias slipped from his quarters. Velvet curtains in the east wing stirred faintly in the draught, as if the building itself exhaled suspicion. His wax-pressed key turned in the service door with a stubborn groan, and then the spell broke. A voice rose down the corridor, Boots struck stone. Lanterns flared to life. He ran. Rain lashed the lawns, his breath ragged as shouts swelled behind him. Silas's men, orderlies in name, wardens in truth, scattered through the dark, their whistles cutting through the storm. Branches tore at his face. Mud sucked at his boots, the weight of the ledgers dragging at his chest. If he fell, if he faltered, the truth itself would vanish into the furnace with him. A flash of lightning revealed the iron fence. He dropped to his belly, clawing beneath roots, gnawing at its base, tearing free as lanterns swung near enough to burn his shadow onto the ground. And then silence. The forest swallowed him, trees closing ranks, rain smothering sound. Lantern light searched and failed. Elias Thorne was gone, but his vanishing was not the end. At dawn, the gates of the Finch estate shuddered beneath the boots of state troopers sworn to secrecy. They carried orders sharpened by testimony, and cipher fragments Elias had risked all to preserve. The east wing offered no resistance, only sedated figures staring with glassy eyes too drugged to notice deliverance. The west wing, once sealed behind Brant's jangling ring of keys, surrendered its horrors. Cells of damp stone and iron revealed bodies slumped in perpetual restraint. Operating rooms reeked of rust and dried blood. Jars of cloudy preservative fluid lined shelves, each holding fragments of those whose names no longer existed outside cipher. And below in the furnace chamber, the troopers struck the earth. Bones, surfaced adult and infant alike, tangled in ash, brittle as chalk. Battle-hardened men wept or crossed themselves, their notes trembling as they recorded what could never be made respectable. The ledgers spoke louder still. They were not casebooks, but toll books documenting a commerce of silence. Fees tallied for transfers signed discreetly by physicians of reputation in Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York. Shell companies moved money. Farms that owned no livestock, charities that raised no schools. Investment houses that issued no returns, each a veil for the hand that paid. Behind them stood the real patrons, industrialists, legislators, judges, men who ruled industry and law with one hand and erased bloodlines with the other. Letters from Alistair Finch's study revealed even more. Across the ocean, men in London, Vienna, Paris, Berlin, wrote back with equal polished cloaking, shared atrocities in the language of heredity and progress. A common project, they called it. A fraternity without borders. Trading notes and specimens, not of plants or minerals, but of human lives. The Finch brothers had built no sanctuary. They had built a node in a machine. A machine older and wider than the town below their hill could ever suspect. The shock of discovery did spread, but only in whispers carried behind closed doors. And as quickly as truth threatened to rise, the machinery of influence moved faster, still smoothing every rough edge of revelation. Editors who received fragments of the journals found their presses silenced by sudden injunctions. Columns already set in type were pulled at the last moment, replaced with glowing articles about progress in medicine, about the triumphs of modern industry. Families whose names appeared in the ledgers leaned on their power, urging that scandal remain. Local, containable, forgettable. Legislators spoke solemnly of the dangers of sensationalism. Esteemed physicians warned that exposing such practices might imperil the legitimacy of true science. Even churchmen, when told of the pit of bones, counseled restraint. Better, they said, to pray for the souls of the departed than to tear at the fabric of society with accusations that could never be undone. and so the evidence Tho gathered began to vanish. Boxes of journals were sealed and spirited to state archives marked confidential access barred. Depositions were filed into drawers that never opened again. The troopers who had unearthed the mass grave were sworn to silence on pain of dismissal. And Elias Thorne, the young doctor whose testimony had set everything in motion, was dismissed as overzealous a man, blinded by idealism, stepping beyond his station. The public received only fragments. A small notice in a regional paper mentioned irregularities at a private institution. Nothing more. No cages, no infants, no map of the grave. What might have been a national reckoning dissolved into silence, swallowed by those with most to lose. The furnace at Finch Sanatorium went dark. The doors were locked. But the smoke of its memory was carried into the winds of forgetfulness. Justice did not vanish but bent. And as it bent, the symmetry between the Finch brothers broke. Alistister, the more public figure, was arrested and lodged in a county jail. At first, he projected the same composure that had won over families and physicians for years. He spoke of envy, of misunderstanding of professional rivals conspiring against him. But the cell stripped him bare. No velvet parlors, no captive audience. Weeks later, he was found lifeless at dawn, suspended from the iron grating by a torn bedsheet. Beside him lay a sheaf of hastily inked pages, half manifesto, half defense. Weakness must be culled or else it shall rule, he had written. He declared his work unfinished, claiming that one day society would honor his methods as necessity, not cruelty. The manuscript was entered into evidence, and then, as if on cue, it disappeared. Only courtroom quotations remain, like fragments of a creed never meant to be read. Silas, more reserved, endured the courts with silence. He faced charges of fraud, malpractice, and unlawful confinement. But the most damning accusations, murder-infanticide. The pit of bones slipped through the sieve of influence. Families whose names filled the ledgers refused to testify, their silence purchased or coerced. Documents that might have tied him directly to atrocity were dismissed as improperly seized. The jury, swayed by arguments of overreach, convicted him only of lesser counts. Years, not life. Time in prison seemed to erode nothing. Letters suggest he remained in touch with sympathizers abroad. Paroled before the decade's end, he vanished. Some whispered of passage to Europe. No grave has ever been found. Eva Brandt, stripped of authority, fell swiftly into collapse. Removed in chains, her defiance soon dissolved into incoherence. By trial, she spoke only in broken phrases of purity and obedience, as though repeating a catechism of doctrine burned too deep to unlearn. Declared unfit to stand, she was committed to another asylum, laid into the same kind of bed she had once ordered others restrained within. Records show she lingered for years, her silence broken only by sudden shrieks when footsteps echoed too close to her door. The aftermath left fragments rather than closure. Court transcripts incomplete. Boxes of evidence-sealed testimonies vanished into archives never opened to the public. Families who had once delivered their kin into Finch care resumed their lives with reputations intact, their shame locked away as securely as any patient had been. And so justice bent and twisted. Alistister's death spared him a verdict. Silas's conviction spared him permanence. Brandt's collapse spared her judgment. The truth was glimpsed only in shards, never in full light. The sanatorium itself was condemned, demolished within months. The east wing fell beneath hammers, its velvet parlors turned to rubble. The west ward resisted iron fittings, groaning as men pried them loose. The grounds were leveled, gardens replanted, grass covering the soil that had once drunk laudanum blood and ash. No marker rose, no plaque was set. Families who returned years later saw only wildflowers and meadow. Never the faint lines of old foundations beneath. The records followed the same path. Journals sealed, marked confidential, shifted into archives under lock and key. Researchers seeking access met only denials. The testimony of Elias Thorne. The field notes of troopers discredited as exaggeration branded the zeal of youth. Public memory reshaped until the Finch estate became only a footnote, an irregularity, a rumor. Elias Thorne himself faded into obscurity. His name absent from directories, his writings unpublished. The price of truth had been exclusion. Silence became his inheritance. Only fragments endured. A half-charred copy of a ledger surfaced decades later in a county archive. Old troopers, their voices cracking, told in late years of the pit of bones of the metallic crack of shovels striking infant skulls. And though official history suppressed these memories, they lingered in whispers, passed like a warning to those who cared to hear. The state buried the walls, the records, the shame. But burial is not erasure. Beneath meadow and archive, beneath silence itself, the memory waits. A shadow in the soil, a ghost in the paper, a story still pressing against the locked doors of history, waiting for someone to listen.